Hello. So just a quick announcement from me before we kick off the afternoon. Thank you so much again to all of you for coming. I hope you had a nice lunch. I hope you got to hang out in the conservatory. We're going to be running quite a tight ship this afternoon, so these next two sessions, there won't be a break in between them, but we will do a short break in between the second session and the third session. So yeah, if I can also just encourage you once again not to leave any gaps in the chairs so people coming in late can get in easily. I'm delighted also now to be able to introduce you to the Executive Director of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, Trevor Timm.
Thank you, Jake, and welcome to the afternoon session. We're really excited at Freedom of the Press Foundation to be hosting the next series of panels, and also welcome to anybody watching online. Actually, we're live streaming the next few sessions on YouTube and X. So as our name suggests, we fight for press freedom rights and protections in the US and around the globe. And we're going to be talking about what we consider to be probably three of the most serious press freedom threats that we face today, this afternoon. One, the surveillance using technology of journalists and the chilling effect it can have on journalists working in the digital age. Two, the government's attempts to force journalists to testify against their sources, often with the threat of jail time. And three, the attack on the right to publish in the United States and around the world, and the long-term effects of the U.S.'s prosecution of Julian Assange. And so, you know, while all these threats are perhaps more dire than ever, you know, I think our goal is to pepper these panels with good news as well, that there are actually more tools than ever for journalists to fight back as well. So the first panel is going to talk about digital security protections and everything that journalists can do with technology to actually protect themselves. With Catherine Herridge, our keynote speaker, we're going to be talking about her case, putting her reputation on the line to defend the rights of all journalists. And then the third panel is going to look at the WikiLeaks case and the aftermath and how an international effort essentially averted the worst case scenario. So as you'll soon realize, you'll be seeing a lot of me this afternoon, so I'm actually going to leave it at that and pass it over to my esteemed Freedom of the Press Foundation colleague, Harlo Holmes. So thanks.
Hi, everyone. All right. Thank you once again. Thanks, Trevor, and thank you all for rejoining us again after lunch. So today we're going to be talking about digital security and the technologies that journalists use to protect themselves, to protect their stories, and to protect their sources. If you've looked at the program, you know that the framing question that we have here is, can technology keep journalists safe? And either from personal experience, or if you're studying this, or if you're just interested, you've definitely heard so many journalists talk this morning and beyond about how they can use technology to protect themselves and their sources. And also, you've heard stories about how they cannot, where they can and where they cannot. And also, you know, how all of this works and comes into play. Similarly, when you think about the stories that you've heard from around the world, you have probably asked your question for whom these technologies can protect and for whom it is not working. So let's take the opportunity to dig deeper into these tools and explore how technologists, advisors, and tool builders, tool makers can help make journalists, at the very best, make the most impactful decisions for their own safety and that of their sources. Okay? So today, I'm joined by Susan McGregor on the far end of our panel here, who is the Associate Research Scholar at Columbia University's Data Science Institute in New York, and also the author of Information Security Essentials, a guide for reporters, editors, and newsroom leaders, which is, I must say, a groundbreaking compendium to the topics that we're going to be discussing this afternoon. We have, actually directly next to me, Runa Sandvik, who is a world-renowned expert in journalist digital security, currently the director at Granite Consulting, where she consults newsrooms, investigative teams, and the like worldwide. And in the middle, we have Rowan S., who's a senior software engineer at our Freedom of the Press Foundation, where they maintain Secure Drop, which is a whistleblowing software that we'll probably hear more a little bit about. But in addition to that, Rowan is a tool builder and digital security trainer and consultant who lends a unique perspective that spans both the technology world and the world of those journalists themselves. So let's get started. And before we dig into the tools and technologies that are underneath them, I want to first introduce another tool that is like not technical at all. And this is called threat modeling. It's a rubric, it's a methodology, a way of thinking about things. And from the term threat modeling, it might sound a little bit scary. And actually, from our combined perspective over like the decades where we've been working in this field, we know that we've borrowed that term from other industries like software development, engineering, military strategy, and even like actuarial science, okay? So it had been somewhat contentious for people in newsrooms to start thinking or to start to fold this language more precisely to identify any dangers that are lurking behind an act of journalism and use that to strategize the best way to thwart it. So from there, after performing this threat modeling rubric, this is where the tools and also the preparation on how to use these tools slot into place. So with that as a framework, before we even talk about technology, I'm going to kick it off to Runa. Well, first and foremost, can you give us a little bit more info on threat modeling? What are current attitudes towards it? And what's an ideal way to perform this risk assessment?
Sure. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for the wonderful intro. So threat modeling, like at its core, really just comes down to like planning your work. It's planning how you're going to work on a specific project, how you're going to report a story, how you're going to keep yourselves, your data, your communications, and your sources safe, how you're going to travel safely. That's sort of like the goal of it, and then the questions that you ask as part of like doing this assessment comes down to what is it that I'm trying to achieve? What's the goal of this project? What's the goal of this story? What is it that I'll be gathering? Will I have photos, video, notes? Will I have a phone with me? Will I have a laptop with me? What could possibly go wrong? Who might take it? Who might access it? Who might hack into it? Who might subpoena it? And how can I, using any sort of possible means, how can I defend that data, that story, those photos, those notes, and really then come up with like a model for how you're going to work on that specific story.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so walk us through what that might look like in terms of like what you've seen recently.
So there was a case in the fall of 2021. Two Norwegian reporters went to Qatar on a reporting trip. They were looking at the conditions of migrant workers ahead of the World Cup. They were there for about a week, meeting different subjects. They did some live streams, took photos, took videos, gathered a lot of notes. As they were leaving their hotel and heading to the airport going home, they were then arrested, held for 30-something hours, had all of their gear seized, sent home without it, and when they did get the gear back, I think about 6 weeks later, the material had been deleted. And if you think through how they might have prepared for that trip, they would have talked about like logistics. How are we getting there? We need flights. We need a place to stay, probably a rental car. They had talked about whether or not they need journalist visas. They had a communications plan with their editors, right? How are we going to check in every day? What's our protocol for if someone doesn't check in? They had a plan for that. the fact that the gear was seized, I don't know that there's necessarily anything they could have like done to really like avoid that scenario. It's like if it happens, it happens. But they could have, and in my opinion should have, had a plan for how to secure the material that's on that equipment, the photos and the videos. And I think we'll talk a bit more about that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. So you're starting to kind of get the idea of what kind of questions are in a risk assessment, and also, when you don't have them, what's at stake, right? I guess we can come back to it a little bit later, but if you want to talk about like any elements of surprise, like even if they did have the best, risk assessment already figured out, what kind of elements of surprise could upturn an otherwise good risk assessment?
I think it is really hard to think about like every possible what if scenario. For one, it's like time consuming. It can be fairly overwhelming. You do need to have a lot of information about all the different things that could go wrong. And at some point, you also still just have to decide that you're going to go pursue the story and decide that like this is enough planning. Because you can like plan something into eternity and never actually go do the story. So at some point, your planning has to be good enough. And like I just said, right? You can't like plan for a scenario in which you avoid getting arrested. Like if you get arrested, you get arrested. So then the question is, well, how can you prepare for that specific scenario? And are there any like apps or tools or processes that you can put in place to make that scenario as safe as possible? It's certainly going to be like scary and uncomfortable and potentially dangerous, but like how can you like make that still as safe as possible?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I guess like the devil is in the details, right? Especially when you're thinking about what tools you need to have in order to mitigate those risks, in order to minimize the amount of damage when a surprise happens, and in order to protect what is ultimately needed to get that story done, which is not only the journalist and their safety, but also, the information that they gathered when out there on that reporting trip, right? Well, let's continue to talk about those tools. Susan, actually, I'd love to kick this off to you. When you think about what actually does protect, let's say, the journalist's interview notes that they take with their source, or their communications when they're checking in with, their editors back at home, things about data protection, blah, 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 accessibility, especially when traveling. What would you say like are fundamental tools that a journalist should have at the ready?
So you mean like specific? Oh, Jesus. Hi, sorry. You mean like particular like apps and technologies, or?
Yeah.
I mean, so I think one thing is that perhaps it's in the headline, right? But encryption, I think something that we talked about a little bit before this panel is that encryption is everywhere, and encryption is kind of necessary for all of these things, right? So many of you, may have heard about various apps and technologies that use encryption. Actually, everything uses encryption. When it comes to computing, it's the only way we really have to secure anything, and it's the only way we have to delete anything short of setting it on fire. So, the things that mostly, I think of using are certainly encrypted communication tools. It's great that we have wide adoption of things like Signal. It's now default on most modern phones that it's going to be encrypted by default with your passcode. That used to be something you had to set manually. You had to opt for it. And then, I think to go back to what Runa was saying, to me, information security is really, it is about planning. And I guess it's not quite a technology, but I actually really believe in having, I work with Chromebooks. And in fact, I started that years ago as a eat your own dog foods kind of thing. And very quickly, it actually became the only device that I used. One thing that I think is really important for folks to think about is just, do you need this with you, right? Whether you're local or international, you can be covering a protest down the road, and if your device gets taken, that's going to be a problem. If it's your computer with your entire life on it. So actually one of the things that I really suggest people do is just get an inexpensive device. Chromebooks are great because they update themselves all the time. You don't tend to store a lot on them. You power wash them. You factory reset them at the click of a button. And that just, for me, when I'm traveling, when I'm doing things, it brings so much peace of mind because you know that your tax return and your family photos and your all of this other stuff is not on this device, which, also could, by the way, just as easily get left in the back of a cab, So I really think that, thinking about the choices that you make each day, and I'm a big proponent of choosing things that work for you on a daily basis, integrating it into your daily practice, because when you're in an unusual situation is not the time you want to be learning how to use a tool that you need, right? So working with your colleagues, working with your sources where possible to identify tools and technologies that are widely acceptable, widely supported, or if you have to kind of go outside the typical infrastructure of your organization, if you're a large organization that has enterprise management, what those special cases may be. But try to just make it part of your everyday life and make sure that you have an encrypted messaging tool that you can rely on and use with the people you need to. Make sure you have those passcodes set up. And as I say, I would have a field device as much as possible, right? Like if you can have a field computer, if that's something that you tend to take with you, make it one that doesn't have the rest of your life on it. And then you can easily clear it off when you need to. And if something happens to it, you haven't lost everything. So I don't know if that answers the question.
No, that's a great place to start. Mention Chromebooks specifically because of their ability to, one, they usually don't keep too much data like on the actual computer, and instead it's all linked to a Google account, right? Which, you could probably set up to make sure that it's not your entire life's Google account, but one that's specific for the purpose.
Yeah, I mean, I want to just acknowledge here, there's no one size fits all, right? When I wrote the book, there's a reason why I wrote it in 3 sections for depending on your job role, because it's different. And to be perfectly blunt, it's also because that's the people that I know who run security companies, that's what they do. Not speaking for Runa, but
it's what I do.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's they're cheap, right? That's the other nice thing. They're extremely affordable. And so, it's not something where we're saying, go out and you need a $10,000 device to do this. Get an inexpensive Chromebook, set up a Google account that is dedicated to the work that you're doing. And, again, as much as you're able to compartmentalize and travel light, even if it's around the corner, the less you have to manage, the more likely you are to be able to manage it well. And the less you have to lose if something goes wrong.
Any more to that? About compartmentalization or Chromebooks or anything else? And also I'm curious to hear about, okay, so that's the computer that you take. And also I can imagine in your scenario, given that it's cloud-based, it would probably be a little bit easier to set yourself up for success if you were working with a computer that would automatically sync a lot of that data to the cloud, I guess.
Yeah, so especially for if you're traveling to places where you have a reliable internet connection, I think a Chromebook is a great option. It will work offline too, but certainly if the goal is to then consistently sync or upload something to the cloud, it does a fantastic job of just automating that for you.
Yeah, thanks so much. If I can jump in and just zoom out a little bit.
Sure.
Something that I really like that both of you talked about is both compartmentalizing and prioritizing. I think in the context of risk assessment, when we start thinking about, I'm going to overhaul my whole life, I'm going to get a new computer, I'm going to choose all these apps, it can become very overwhelming. And I think my favorite things about risk assessment are the ability to prioritize and specifically prioritize the things you want to mitigate rather than trying to tackle everything at once. So this whole domain can be overwhelming and monolithic, and I think breaking it down, as you said, into small steps, like what do I need to perform this task, what do I need for this upcoming trip, can also help you tease apart like the likelihood of a certain problem, the impacts that it will have, and prioritize what you want to do next. And I think that the underlying principles of what you're saying in terms of like this particular device will help me accomplish this task can be applied whether or not we're talking about Chromebooks or other devices or even analog tools.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Love to hear more about burner devices and analog tools, and we will get to that. Well, actually, okay. So let's talk about burner devices before I ask my next question. So we have this like separate computer. We decide to go with a Chromebook in this scenario. What about the phone that you use? A lot of people do ask if it's okay for me to bring my phone to the protest down the road, or to an entirely different country where that it's possible that that device may be taken from you. Is it still okay to bring that device in that case? And in which case, if it's not, what do you suggest people do?
Sure. I think the number one question is sort of like what is the goal of the phone? Because I think oftentimes people will use the term burner phone and mean anonymous phone, never ever linked to me. I only ever paid cash for it, and I use it in such a way that it cannot be linked back to me. Very hard to do, bit of a different use case. So if I'm just going to now talk about a travel phone, and so for me the goal there is. And I think the first question becomes, if I'm traveling to London and I bring my phone, if someone takes it from me, if it's lost, if it's stolen, if it's seized, if I'm forced to unlock it, number one, how likely is it that happens? And then number two, if it does happen, how concerned am I about the material, the apps, the data, the photos that are on the device? For a lot of the trips that I go on, I'm not very concerned. I travel with that phone, totally fine. Then the question is, for certain trips to certain countries, for certain purposes, projects, I may decide that that's not fine. I am not okay bringing my usual phone and putting myself in a situation where that might be lost or stolen or seized or then unlocked. And that is a case where I would have a travel phone set up just for that trip with what I need access to for that period of time.
Okay. All right. So I did want to bring it back to the feasibility of this, because in an ideal world, that would be, I would have like a bajillion Chromebooks. I would have several travel phones, and they're all new iPhones, and they're perfect. However, we know that for a variety of reasons, that's beyond reach. It could be beyond reach because you are a freelance journalist and you do not have the funds, right? It could be beyond reach because you are... you cannot bring that particular technology into the place where you're going. There's a number of, or it could be, that the news organization that hires you, like this big, like think a AP or a Bloomberg or whatever, although they're pretty good at this, but still, hypothetically, they decide like, nope, you have to have this corporate device. I'm sorry. Have you ever navigated these, the clash of like what's ideal and ultimately what's realistic in any of these situations? And what would you recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. I think coming back to what you said earlier, Susan, about different profiles and different types of organizations, there's a huge distinction between the smaller investigative news outlet and the larger corporate newsroom, and we can get tempted to creating one-size-fits-all advice, which, as you alluded to, does not work. And so in the case of a smaller investigative outlet, like some of the ones we heard from this morning, just the challenge of procuring up-to-date devices, even having reliable backup systems, just having the infrastructure in place can be a significant financial hurdle. And in that case, not from a perspective of risk, but from a perspective of resources, you're thinking about more like a small business versus a corporate newsroom that has enterprise device management, and you're thinking about a different set of concerns. And they could both have a very similar risk profile in terms of the severity and intensity of the threats they're facing for their investigations, but they could need very different types of tools. Another thing that isn't directly related to, how do we procure phones and computers, but that's related to just the infrastructure of newsrooms is we're seeing the trend of physical newsrooms closing down, work shifting to remote, work from home, dispersed, and so on.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, or even the context of working in a physical newsroom not being safe the same way that it perhaps has been in some regions in the past. And so because of all of that, because of all of those changes, the tools that we make have to adapt to the new context. In the case of SecureDrop, which is a tool that I have helped maintain since 2019, the premise of SecureDrop originally involved physical security. You need the physical security of the place where the servers are housed, and you need the physical security of where the journalist assets are stored. And so to zoom out, because I just started talking about the thing, SecureDrop is a whistleblowing platform that allows sources and journalists to communicate and provides anonymity protection for sources. Also provides malware mitigation for newsrooms in terms of creating an environment where you can accept submissions without introducing malware to your network, and also provides data sovereignty and control over the material received. All of this was premised on the idea that newsrooms could have a physical location to house servers to receive submissions. As that changes, our tools also have to evolve.
Okay. What does actually, that's a really, really compelling thing that complicates a threat model, like where you physically are safe to do your work, and how that affects the threat modeling around building the corresponding tool. Can you give us an example of where that works really well, but then where that model falls down from a SecureDrop perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're a bit cagey about specific stories that have come through SecureDrop for obvious reasons. As the maintainers of the tool, we have no visibility into individual SecureDrop instances, and so we rely on journalists to tell us, hey, by the way, that thing you read, that was pretty good, thanks a bunch. Where it has worked well is, to be frank, in more of a Western and European context, where we've seen physical security and sort of rights protections for journalists in newsrooms, as in it's against the law to raid the newsroom and so on, and so you're able to have the size and resources and infrastructure to maintain servers and to have journalists in the office checking those systems. Where it's worked less well is in regions where, for example, raids and physical interference are more common, or because the system relies on the Tor network for communications between source and journalist. If you're in a region that has very low Tor usage, the anonymity protections of Tor are not a guarantee, because it's possible to identify there's so few Tor users, here's one, perhaps they're a source, right? And so there's a lot of different contexts, even in countries where there's high numbers of Tor users. If you are a Tor user in a remote area, that's not the same kind of protection as being in a city and camouflaging amongst the other users of the network to disguise your traffic. So these are just a few complications with the idea of anonymity protections for sources.
I was going to say, do you want to say a few words about what Tor is?
Yeah, thank you. So Tor is a routing network that provides anonymity protections by bouncing your internet traffic through various different locations. And we use it in SecureDrop in order to disguise the location of originating traffic so that we can't say, oh, this source is in this country or in this city or in this IP block.
But also, if you've ever read or perhaps written about the dark web,
Yeah.
that's Tor.
Heard it here first.
So just to say that, like many of these tools and technologies, Tor originally was developed and is largely maintained for the purposes of protecting sensitive traffic, protecting people. But obviously sometimes has other activities, and just to, yeah.
Yeah.
But essential.
Absolutely. Well, okay, so we're talking about SecureDrop in the context of a tool that works really well for this particular threat model. What then does a newsroom that faces those particular challenges that you mentioned? What are some better, or not better, but what are some alternatives that still, like helps them fulfill that goal of protecting the communications between those journalists in that newsroom and these end sources out there, potential or otherwise really motivated?
Yeah, thank you. I think to answer that, I have to zoom out a bit again and talk about the principles behind Secure Drop. So as I mentioned before, the first principle is anonymity protections for sources. So to the strongest possible extent, we do not want the system to reveal who the source is of a particular leak or submission. Another principle is malware mitigation for newsrooms. So if we're telling you, contrary to all of our other digital security trainings, this is a great time to receive files from strangers, we have to make sure that we're going to keep you safe while we're doing that. And the way that Secure Drop handles that is forcing you to open files in a quarantined and offline environment to avoid the possibility either of introducing malware to the rest of your devices and networks, or to avoid the possibility of like an accidental information disclosure, for example, opening a file that then has a tracking beacon that sends a notification to the originator, oh, this file was opened in this newsroom. And then lastly, the idea that journalism organizations should maintain control over their own data. So rather than, and this is the reason I'm coming to all of these is because you can implement these principles whatever tools you are using.
That's brilliant, yeah.
Rather than entrusting your data to a third party who can access it, who can maintain control over it, who can deny your access to it, who can potentially turn over access to it to a law enforcement agency or other party without your knowledge or consent, make sure that you maintain data sovereignty and control over the data that you receive or the data that you produce in the course of your investigation. And so those are the high-level principles of Secure Drop, but also can be applied to any other system that you use. Unfortunately, there are other phenomenal systems that are out there. Global Leaks is another system that is used for submission handling. There are other tools. Signal was mentioned, but it's really difficult to find and build tools that are suitable to a lot of contexts. But those principles remain. So if you are receiving submissions over Signal, you don't have the same level of anonymity protection for your sources, but in your context, with your risk assessment, you may find that that's a sufficient level of protection for you and your sources. And if that's the case, you've solved one piece of the puzzle. The other pieces of the puzzle are, how do I not get malware? How do I maintain control over the data? So you can see that all of these aspects interplay, and depending on your region and depending on the types of investigations that you're doing, you may need to have multiple tools. And in fact, the newsrooms that we work with generally have multiple means for sources to contact them, multiple different workflows. And in cases where Secure Drop may be overkill, like for example, if you're not working on a story where the anonymity of the source is essential, you may be able to rely on other easier to use methods. I'm going to pause here in case anyone wants to add anything, but maybe we can come back to usability later.
Yeah.
Can I actually ask a question of you? Well, so when I first started this work and publishing into the computer security space academically, this was one that got a big laugh, which is that when we're saying anonymity in this context, what we mean is not traceable. As in, there's no metadata, no telephone number, no IP address that connects the source to the material. And that's meaningful because your internet provider, your phone provider, your source's internet provider, your source's phone provider can trace that information to connect a real human to the device, to that address, to that phone number, et cetera. So I just want to clarify that, and I apologize if this is obvious, but that, when we're talking about anonymity here, you might eventually actually come to know the identity of that source, but the digital traces do not connect them. And that's a really important protection that Secure Drop provides that is pretty unique in the technical space. The question I was going to ask you, because this had come up for me recently, especially looking at smaller news organizations in the US, but I think this applies globally, how do you feel about an HTTPS web form? So basically an SSL, so a secure, you've got HTTPS on your website. If there's a form there and somebody submits, at least as a first contact issue, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and also thank you for the clarification about anonymity. The way that we frame it is the system shouldn't dox the source, but exactly as you described. So I'm so sad that I'm going to be the first person to say it depends on this panel. I was really hoping that it wasn't going to be me.
It never depends.
Yeah, so we encourage the use of like a tips form or a contact form that is in the ClearNet, that is just, TLS protected page, not a web form, but just a page that says, here's the number of different ways that you can reach us, right? And so the same thing with email, the same thing with a web form. Where is that going? Where is it hosted? Who can see that you are visiting the web page, like the type of metadata that's created just when you even visit a web page. There are some cases where it is okay to email or use a web form or just get in touch. But in general, we try to avoid this as a first-line recommendation because of the difficulty of, we call the first contact problem, which you discussed yesterday. You can't undo it once you've created a trace that you are interested in being a source, right? And so if you visit a page that says submission information here, and if you're kind of contacting the newsroom, we really want people for two reasons. One, we want people to make their first contact the most secure form of contact because you can't upgrade your security. And two, we want visitors to the website to be as indistinguishable from potential sources as possible. So we don't want sources to have an identifying behavior different than casual readers of a website. And so to get back to the point of what about the web form, it's extremely uncommon that a newsroom is entirely hosting their own infrastructure, right? So you're relying on content management systems and external providers, and there may be trackers and so on just embedded into like the natural running of a CMS. So our suggestion is don't use a web form. Provide a non-interactive place where you can say, here's all the other ways to contact us. I don't know if that answers the question. It's for us like similar to don't send an email.
So, but because my understanding, which might be wrong, but is that if it's after the slash, right? If it's after the .com, .org, whatever, it's not distinguishable.
Hold on one second.
But
all right.
Yeah, before we go into all that, we'll take this offline.
So the only thing that I want to say though is...
A good question. Let's unpack a little bit of this for the sake of conversation, because ultimately what we are discussing is what we call first contact conundrum. And if someone decides that they are going to, as a source, enter into an unsolicited, relationship with a journalist that they admire, that they trust, they are inclined to go to their website and find the most easy way to reach that journalist, right? And so what we're actually discussing right now are the safest ways to have that initial conversation. And in the past, you might have definitely seen, I don't know, like back in like the 90s or whatever, you might have seen like something that says, got a tip, just leave it here on a website. And for a variety of reasons that you two can continue to discuss here, now I'm giving you the go-ahead to, that is unsafe and actually sets that initial first contact up for failure.
Well, yeah, the reason why I ask actually
Yes.
specifically, so I'm a researcher, that's what I do now mostly, and I actually recently surveyed several hundred local news organizations in the US, and we actually found, looking at their tip pages, and what we found was actually a lot of them do have web forms. And so taking the point about where does the data go, right? Like that web form is probably hosted wherever it's hosted, right? Likely not on a server in your newsroom that you control, right? So I think the data sovereignty piece, right, is who has the physical computer or drive that the data is on, and unless it's you've got some challenges.
And even if it is you, you've got some challenges.
Well, yeah, different
but
challenges.
Still,
but
yes.
So something that we could come back to then, just to bring it full circle, is, no, not even move on, but is the issue of encryption. So there are cases where you might say, I perfectly trust the server administrators who run the service where the web form is, and but we don't want to leave that in the hands of whatever party that is. And so our recommendation is not just to ensure that the metadata about who is contacting whom is minimized, but also to ensure, of course, that the contents of what you're saying, hey, I have a very important leak about this topic, is encrypted and ideally is end-to-end encrypted, right? Yeah. And so to make it concrete, when you talk about the issue of like what could a malicious administrator or a malicious admin actor on a platform do, there were cases, I think in 2014, 2015, of former Twitter employees who used their administrative privileges to access user data on behalf of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And so a case like that would indicate that if somebody has powers and internal powers and admin powers over a platform, they could use that for nefarious purposes. And so one of the goals of Secure Drop is to ensure that only the end parties can receive unencrypted access to the contents.
So it's not only just about like that, how it presents itself to a source and to a journalist. It's not just about a website with a janky web form from the early 2000s. It could be the difference between reaching out to a journalist over Twitter, or using another platform that has these fundamentals of end-to-end encryption and also at least, like some semblance of data sovereignty at play. I'm going to actually bring this back to Runa. What other tools fulfill these really, really key mandates?
I mean, I think to your point, you can sort of like pick 1 out of 3, 2 out of 3. With Secure Drop, certainly 3 out of 3. So I worked for the New York Times between 2016 and 2019 as the head of cybersecurity for the newsroom. And in that role in 2016, I teamed up with a couple of reporters, a couple of engineers, and some infrastructure folks to set up the New York Times tips page. So we then created nytimes.com/tips, and we listed different ways in which that anyone could safely, securely, and also anonymously submit information to the New York Times. A goal there was also to sort of try to get around this like first contact problem that we talked about, because without that page, if you wanted to share something with the New York Times, you had to first like figure out who you want to share it with. And then you had to find a way to contact them. And then you had to like call them, DM them on Twitter, send them an email again, try to call one more time, maybe leave a voicemail. It became really difficult, one, to get a hold of some of them. And two, you have in that process of just trying to reach out, left a whole lot of trace all over the place about the fact that you're trying to get in touch with a reporter at the Times. So by setting up a tips page and setting up Secure Drop, it was a way of allowing the public to contact the New York Times and leave the sort of internal sorting and verifying and figuring out what to do with it to the people in the newsroom. And that page back then had Signal, WhatsApp, Secure Drop, regular email, and encrypted email, and postal mail, giving the source plenty of option to figure out then which tool is easiest for me to use, which one am I most familiar with, which one is secure enough for my use case, and really leaving it up to them, giving them plenty of options.
So New York Times is one of the pioneers in doing exactly this. And if you ever were curious, if you do, I think it's still there. If you go to like newyorktimes.com/tips, that's where you see all of those instructions there. And this actually makes me think about something that you started to bring up, Susan, about why it's important. And perhaps, Ro, you'd also want to talk about that. Why it's important to structure a tip line that way, especially behind a https news.org/tips.
Yeah, I mean, the short version, right, is, I was like, unless my entire understanding of the internet is wrong, is that basically when you have a secured web connection, that HTTPS, and there's nothing wrong with the icon, right? Icon's good. Anything that comes after the main domain, so if you have, newsorg.com, newsorg.org, whatever it is, / right? And then whatever, your article page. Everything after that slash cannot be seen by the internet service provider, okay? So I know you went to newsorg.org, but I do not know what you read there. This is why many years ago I actually wrote a piece for Columbia Journalism Review about this. The shift to HTTPS for news organizations was a big deal, because up until then, your internet service provider, which, as we know in many regions, is government-owned and operated, could say, I know what you were reading, right? It's like, I know what article you read. I know what page you visited. It gives you some flexibility. And so if you do have an individual who wants to become a source, if it's after that slash and you're on HTTPS, they don't know what they're, nobody can prove that they went to the tips page or not. So that's significant. I do just want to say too, though, that like one thing I think is important to mention as we talk about resources is just expertise, right? Yeah. So I think, one of the reasons why I'm always looking for kind of the most accessible version of things, right, is that you're not going to get all the things. And P.S., in case we haven't said it, there's no such thing as perfect security, right? There's no being protected from everything. We're talking about minimizing harm. We're talking about minimizing risk. And that's why the threat modeling piece, which, in a lot of investigation work, it's the same thing as a risk assessment. It's just that's the language we use in, computer security is threat model. But thinking about who you're trying to protect and from what. I also think the for how long is a piece that we leave out a lot.
It's true.
And actually can have a significant impact on the decisions that you need to make. But one of the reasons why I think it's useful to also talk about some of these more accessible, more usable solutions is that I think a lot of news organizations don't have the technical expertise, to do some of the things that we're talking about. And that doesn't make them bad, and it would be great. And, like FPF has a wonderful program to support news organizations that don't have those resources. But there's always going to be a kind of balancing, process to figure out what works for you, what works for your colleagues, what works for your newsroom, what works for your sources. And I think ideally educating yourself a little bit about the sort of the metadata issue, end-to-end encryption, which is only you and the person you sent it to can read it, not the platform, not the service, is really helpful because it helps you make decisions, right? When do I need what? And start to get familiar with these tools.
I absolutely agree, and I think what's clear even in this discussion is just tool makers can't discount usability impacts. The fact that it's so difficult to tease apart all of these nuances, the fact that we also have to say, oh yeah, and by the way, don't do any of this on your work computer if you have one, don't do any of this from home if you can avoid it. Like there are so many difficulties and nuances, and I think that as the risks change and as we try to be better with the tools that we create, we really have to focus on usability.
That's, and actually, thank you for summing up exactly what I was just going to say. There's a lot behind how these principles ultimately express themselves in tools that we take for granted. The very, very fact that what Susan described about, having a secure connection on the internet and HTTPS and all that, we take it for granted because we just don't see like this warning triangle. And otherwise, that's it. Signal is in everyone's hands, Signal or WhatsApp, right? And this provides that hard-fought end-to-end encryption that we are telling you is so important. So now let's actually, so I have two questions I'd love for you all to address, which is, as tool builders especially, what do they need to keep this continual lines of communications open, where you have what you need to build the tools that people can just take for granted given everything that's behind them, or that goes into them?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a hard question. What do we need as tool builders? Mm-hmm. So I think a few things. As I've mentioned, usability is a huge concern, and the feedback that we get from the organizations that use our tools or that use tools in the community and share their information with us, that's invaluable, and we appreciate it and we need more of it. I think that for those of us who've been building tools that have focused on traditional Western, North American, and European newsrooms, we're playing catch up, and that's not the way that it should be. And also, there are threat models that are really, really hard to solve for, that we all need to be trying to solve for. It's really difficult from a technical level to solve for situations like browser-based encryption, which we don't have a great story for, but stay tuned. Or to solve for things like, how do you handle it when you need to put things on a server and you're not sure if that server is going to be rated, or you're not sure if there's going to be snapshots taken of the disk and RAM of that server. Like, how do you solve for those contexts? Those are genuinely hard problems, and that still does not excuse a lack of usability or a lack of accessibility in different contexts. So I think what tool makers need and what we're trying to work towards is tools that can be more easily deployed in more different contexts and that are less of a maintenance burden on users, tools that are localized, and yeah, tools that take into account different sizes and scales. We also can learn a lot. So we've talked a lot this morning already about changes in the Western newsroom context. These changes may be new to us, but they're not new to all regions around the world, and there's a lot that we can learn from newsrooms who have already been grappling with the kind of threats that we're alluding to since time.
Yes.
And so we can learn from them. We can value that as technical expertise and appreciate it and make sure that's not just a one-way exchange. And yeah, we can just make sure that our tools are suitable for a variety of different contexts.
That's a whole word, and I would love to unpack that seriously. Because what else do we see, technology notwithstanding? And I have full faith that engineers like Ro and those on their team will solve problems like browser-side, end-to-end encryption.
Don't say solve. Just say work on.
Well, you'll get there. You'll get there. But that said, how do you solve for, authoritarianism, where you can't even bring that technology into a place? How do you solve for legal threats to encryption, which we see popping up here and there? Hopefully, we mallet them down, but they continue to pop up. And I'm sure there's plenty of threats on the horizon. And I'd love to hear from our researchers and consultants and people who evangelize the power of these tools. How do we continue?
I think for me, I always just come back to the tools that we need to work safely do exist, but we need to know about them. We need to know how to use them. We need to use them in the right way at the right time. And then still, to your point, and I think with everything that we talked about today, there may then still be limits. We don't have any guarantees here, but we can, by educating ourselves on the tools that are available, on these different apps, on the pros and cons of the different apps, and when you should use one over the other, I think we can go a long way in protecting the journalists and the sources and the communications.
I may have lost track of the question, but I think that I feel like one of the most important things is that I think for folks who are building tools, really just talking to people about how they do their work. What is that like? Just tell me the story of a story, right? I have done a lot of research with journalists about information security over the years, and what has always impressed me is they always say, I'm not worried about it. But then you talk to them and you ask them about the story, they say, well, I just don't put anything sensitive in email. Right? And so I think for tool builders, we have to kind of stay close to what people are doing. I think actually that's a practice for journalists themselves, right? We've talked a lot here about threat modeling, and my guess is everyone in this room is feeling like this sounds like a lot of work.
Yeah.
Right? By the way, I have a job to do, right? I'm supposed to be reporting and publishing stories. I don't have time to go get, a mini master's on this stuff. And, I think, and by the way, many years ago, I was in a newsroom, and I worked at the Wall Street Journal for a number of years, and that was part of how I came to this work, the information security for journalists. And that's one of the reasons why I would say I think it needs you do little bits at a time, but make it part of your regular workflow. When I joined the Wall Street Journal in 2007, there was a rule that we all had to work from home one day a month. And the reason why is because the offices were right next to the site of the September 11th attacks in New York City. That office was closed for well over a year. And so it was understood as part of the continuity of the newsroom that you had to be able to work remotely. And you don't do that by saying, a crisis happened, now do everything differently, right? So if you think about it as a holistic practice, I'm not saying, ditch your computer and go get a Chromebook. I'm saying, if you can, get a Chromebook. Right? Start by taking it with you sometimes. see what happens if on a small assignment you just use that, right? Like I said, I did that as an experiment. It turned out, and eventually it became the only thing I needed, the only thing I used. I didn't even notice. So I would say also that for the journalists, there's enormous power also in that experiment, in reflecting on your own work. What are you actually doing? What are the tools that you're actually using and not actually using? Because that will tell you the story of what you need. And a great thing to do is to just keep a little diary. Just, this is what I did. This is the devices I took with me. This is how I use them. If you want to change a practice, you first have to know what you're doing. And that's not something most of us reflect on deeply every day. So I would really encourage that as like, take your paper notebook, be like, this is what I had with me, this is what worked, this is what didn't. And you can use that as a tool later on to go back and say, okay, here's some places where there might be room for change. Or, great resource to share with our friends here, to help them understand what needs solving in your space. I'll end with a plug for one of the reasons why when I first came to Columbia, I was with the School of Journalism, and why I started working with researchers is because I was like, free help. So I really do encourage you. I was really impressed when I started doing research into this. The computer security community globally is extremely interested in supporting the work of journalists. And, send me an email. Like, I'll put you in touch. Like, the point is that there are people who are extremely interested in solving these problems, both in the nonprofit world and in the academic world. And what they really need is a clear understanding of what you do and how you do it and where you need support. And so those partnerships, especially in these times, like, free help is always good. And you can find some really, really valuable resources. And that's something we've done in the past. But, I just really encourage you to think about that as an option, whatever kind of situation you're in, freelancer or organizational. So.
Thank you very, very much. I'm going to conclude by really encouraging you to reach out to any of us with any further questions about some of the technologies or methodologies that we discussed here, or want to talk about threat models of your own. We're here today and tomorrow. And thank you very, very much to Susan McGregor, Rowan S., and Runa Sandvik. Thank you.
Right into this next panel. So hi again, I'm Trevor Timm, Executive Director at Freedom of the Press Foundation, and I am honored to be joined by Catherine Herridge, who is an Emmy Award-winning journalist who covers national security from Washington, D.C. Over her 3-decade career, she has worked for ABC News, actually here in London, Fox News and CBS, and she currently runs her own independent news site, Catherine Herridge Reports, which you can find on Substack. But the reason that she is here today is to talk about her legal case, which right now is one of, if not the most important press freedom cases currently in the court system in the United States. So thank you, Catherine, for joining. I will just say up front that the oral arguments for her case in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals are actually happening next week. And so there are some things that Catherine is just not going to be able to talk about. And so hopefully the audience can understand that as we do questions at the end. But Catherine, maybe for the audience, you can start off by talking in broad strokes about how this case started and where it is now.
Well, I'm so glad to be here, and thank you to everyone from the Center for Investigative Journalism for holding this panel. When I heard from James earlier this year to come and appear and to talk, it couldn't have come at a better time for me. It had come in just after February. That month, I had my job terminated from CBS News. CBS News seized my investigative reporting files, which were ultimately returned, and then I was held in contempt of court by a federal court in Washington, and all of that happened in a 16-day period. In a nutshell, the plaintiff in my case has brought a Privacy Act lawsuit against the U.S. government, including the Defense Department, the FBI, the Justice Department, and the Department of Homeland Security. In the course of that lawsuit, the plaintiff is seeking the disclosure of my confidential source or sources that were the foundation for a series of national security reports I did when I was at Fox News. In this particular case, the FBI had done an investigation into the plaintiff and her school, which catered to military personnel. No charges were brought, but the U.S. Defense Department cut off her government funding on a national security basis. I think it's important to know that there's no allegation of defamation that relates to my reporting on this national security case. And right now, I am just a witness in this litigation. I am not a party to the litigation.
And so the general principle that you are trying to uphold in this case is something called reporter's privilege. Mm-hmm. And for those in the audience who aren't in the U.S. or aren't familiar with that general principle, which is actually kind of a bedrock of press freedom rights in the United States, maybe you can explain a little bit more about how it works.
Sure. So for full disclosure, I was born in Canada. I'm a dual Canadian-U.S. citizen, though I've spent most of my career working for American media companies. In the United States, under the First Amendment, so the freedom of speech, there's a qualified or limited privilege called the reporter's privilege. And in simple terms, it means that reporters should not have to speak or identify their confidential sources in their reporting. What's important here is that in virtually every state, 49 out of 50, there is this reporter's privilege or reporter shield law, but there is no federal shield law in the United States. And my case is being brought at the federal level.
And so I think it's also important to point out that this is the type, or a very similar type of privilege that literally hundreds of millions of Americans have. So in the United States, conversations between your attorney are privileged as well, meaning that in only very limited circumstances can an attorney testify against their client. The same thing goes for doctors and their patients, priests, and of course there is a spousal privilege as well. So anybody married in the United States has the privilege to refuse to testify against their spouse. And I think it's probably very obvious for people why this is so important in all of those scenarios, because the confidential relationship is everything, and just like it is for journalists.
So I always say to people that if you do investigative reporting, if you don't have a credible pledge of confidentiality to your sources, your investigative toolbox is empty. You are out of business. You cannot rely on whistleblowers with firsthand knowledge of government wrongdoing or government corruption to come forward without a credible pledge of confidentiality. And what's decided in the appellate court in the United States, and I say this with a great sense of humility, it's going to set the ground rules for every working journalist in the United States. So the stakes could not be higher in this case.
And so, there's a couple aspects of the case that I want to get into. But so this case was already heard in the district court or a lower court. And so can you talk a little bit in general about what the judge said in that case, and actually what he then forced you to do before appealing?
Well, I want to be very respectful of the legal process, and I'm not here today to litigate the case. If you go into the public court record, what you'll see is that I was subpoenaed, and I was forced to sit for a deposition in the case, and I respectfully declined to identify my confidential source or sources for the series of national security reports. The way the litigation played out in the district court in Washington is that in order to protect my confidential sources and my First Amendment rights, I had to be held in contempt of court. I had to be in what they call a final order. So really there was no exit ramp for me. I had to be held in contempt. I don't take being held in contempt of court lightly for obvious reasons. But I had to reach that stop point in order to get to the next phase, which will play out in the appellate court. What I would say is that even being held in contempt of court, I believe, has a chilling effect on journalism. I've heard from journalists privately who say they really support me and the principle and the position that I've taken, but it's also given them pause about their own work, whether it's worth it to take on stories of government accountability or national security if they may ultimately end up in the same position I'm in today.
And, again, for the international audience, being held in contempt of court is an incredibly serious offense. In criminal cases, when journalists have refused to testify against their sources in the past, they have often gone to prison for weeks or months or even years. And this is a civil case, and in the decision, the judge made it clear that there would be a fine of $800 per day.
That's right.
And potentially indefinitely, depending on how far the case goes along.
And just for some context, I'm very grateful that those fines have been stayed pending the appeal, but I'm sure everyone in this room understands that fines of $800 a day, which may escalate over time, would be crippling for any individual.
So at this point, this case has gone on for multiple years. I imagine it's been incredibly expensive and time-consuming and of course, stressful. Just curious if you can share, how you've personally dealt with it all.
Well, on a personal basis, I'd like to just share a story. I don't want to get too choked up about it, but when I was subpoenaed, our youngest son, who was a teenager, so sort of aware of the world and what was happening, he said, Mom, are you going to go to jail? Are we going to lose our house? Are we going to lose everything that you've ever worked for in your career? And I wanted to tell him that in the United States, where we say we really value democracy and we value the role of a vibrant media and diverse voices seeking government accountability, that this was impossible. But I could not offer him that assurance. I've been working for 37 years. I'm 60 years old. I'm in the last chapter of my career. And I understand that for younger journalists who are just starting out, they cannot withstand the kind of legal and financial pressure that I have been facing. I've been very fortunate to have the full support of my previous employer, Fox News, that has mounted a very vigorous defense of the First Amendment and the reporter privilege. But we're now in a marketplace where there are more and more independent journalists, smaller digital newsrooms, and First Amendment case, the protection of confidential sources, this kind of litigation would be crushing for them. It would destroy these newsrooms. And the reason that matters to me is because it limits the diversity of voices in the marketplace. And this is really where I see the media landscape shifting in the future.
And so, with the,
I have one more thing,
go ahead.
If you don't mind. I just want everyone in this room to know that when I faced that choice, I did not lose a night's sleep over my decision to protect my confidential sources. This was never a question in my mind. But it doesn't mean that this has been an easy road to walk, and it doesn't mean it hasn't been a burden. I think one of the greatest burdens is that you feel silenced. There are many things I'd like to say about my experience, but I'm not able to do that, not at this stage with the pending litigation and out of respect for the courts. But it's no small thing to do this. I feel very proud that I'm standing on principle, but I wouldn't change anything. I've never had a moment of hesitation in this entire process.
Incredible. This is, as a journalist, you are, of course, used to reporting on other people. And, all of a sudden this has turned you into a story
Uncomfortably
as well.
so.
And, has this affected your work as a professional working journalist as well?
I think that professionally it's difficult. If I was a young journalist starting out and I found myself in First Amendment litigation to protect my sources, I don't think it's the greatest calling card when you're looking for work. Many news organizations are risk averse for reasons I don't think I need to explain to this room. That doesn't change the calculation. I said it earlier, but I'm going to say it again. I think simply holding a reporter in contempt professionally has a chilling effect. A chilling effect on other reporters taking on tough topics, and a chilling effect on confidential sources who may think twice about coming forward in the future, not knowing what the outcome of this particular case is going to be.
So previously you mentioned that 49 states in the U.S. have some version of reporters' privilege or shield laws, as we call them. But there, somewhat notoriously, has never been a federal shield law. And often in federal courts and in federal cases, that's where the most serious cases can arise. There's a rather famous case that happened about 10 years ago involving Pulitzer Prize winner James Risen from the New York Times, who faced a years-long legal battle, quite similar in the length and the severity to yours, where he faced jail time. And so, I mentioned in my intro that there is some good news here. And amazingly, there is a shield bill in Congress, actually the strongest shield bill we have ever seen, that's also never been close to passing. And, I don't know if anybody's heard, but we recently had an election in the United States, which, of course, is going to throw everything off balance. But what a lot of people may not know is that it doesn't, just because we held the election does not mean that Congress changes over immediately and the presidency doesn't change over immediately. Congress holds one more lame duck session before January, before everything changes over. And this bill is called the Press Act, and it would do two things. It would essentially bar the government from surveilling journalists by going to tech giants like Google or Facebook or AT&T to gather their communications records. And most importantly, in this case, it would bar subpoenas to journalists to force them to testify against their sources under the threat of jail time. And so you actually testified in Congress about this a few months ago. I was hoping you could explain, why you were compelled to do so, even when, many lawyers would say that maybe you should not talk about these issues until your case is over.
I was very grateful to testify to Congress about the protection of confidential sources and the Press Act. I just feel like we have a historic opportunity to expand the shield laws in the United States and at the federal level. This legislation has common sense exceptions. For example, if there was an imminent threat of violence or terrorism or a threat to critical infrastructure, those are exceptions that can lead to disclosure. It also acknowledges that the way we define a journalist has really changed. And you correct me if I'm wrong here, but what the legislation says is that if you are regularly gathering information to publish, then you are a journalist. And it acknowledges that the marketplace has changed, whether you're writing newsletters or you're publishing or broadcasting your reports on X or YouTube or Instagram. I felt very nervous testifying, and I'm not generally a nervous person in front of large groups of people, but I felt nervous because the issue is so important to me now. I have complete respect for the courts. I'm not trying to litigate my case, and I don't even know if the Press Act, if it passed, would affect me individually. That would be a matter for the courts. But I felt I had to testify because I know that after 37 years in this business, that if I could have a legacy and leave it to the next generation, it would be this federal shield law. I have so much concern for many in this audience who are working independently or going to launch newsletters or websites of their own, that you're going to need these kind of protections in the United States. Because without these protections, these fledgling voices will be crushed. And I think this would be one of the terrible losses of the next decade. I'm so excited to see journalism sort of harnessing the technology and creating a new diversity of voices. And I think, and this is, personally speaking, the greatest thing I can do in this last chapter of my career is to try and make that possible, to give them the firmest footing, to make a go of it, and to strengthen democracy in the process, whether it's a Democratic administration or whether it's a Republican administration.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that round of applause is well-deserved just because, for us at Freedom of the Press Foundation, we're really inspired by that fact that not only you are going through this case and are willing to stick your neck out, but in a lot of cases, journalists aren't used to necessarily sticking up for their own rights or even their own, or even the rights of other journalists for various reasons. And, so I'm curious from, as you have gone through this, do you think that journalists in general need to be more vocal about sticking up for press freedom rights?
Well, from my own experience, I had to really reflect on this point because I'm not used to, as Trevor is saying, advocating for myself. I've spent my career trying to advocate for other people or trying to seek accountability for other people or speaking truth to power, whether it's to Republicans or to Democrats. Really, if I could say there's a theme to my career, it's been going for the underdog and trying to support them. So when I made a decision to advocate for the Press Act on Capitol Hill, it took a little bit of a sort of reset for me personally. When I testified, it also came at a time that I was fighting for another very important principle. When my job was terminated at CBS News, they also seized my reporting files, which included confidential source information reporting. This is a red line that must never be crossed by any employer in the future. I heard from contacts that I've worked with for many years who've worked with me to try and expose government corruption and wrongdoing, and they had very serious concerns that they might be exposed because CBS News had seized my records. When the network of Walter Cronkite seizes your investigative reporting files, that is an attack on investigative journalism. There's no way around it. And I likened it to a journalistic rape when I testified on Capitol Hill. There was public outrage. This is not standard practice. At ABC, at Fox News, when I left, I took all my records with me. It was not typical for a corporation to take control of my reporting records. With the help of my union, SAG-AFTRA, my records were returned after about a week. And I'm so grateful to them. CBS told Congress that they hadn't, in fact, seized my records, that they had only secured them, which I felt showed they had a very difficult relationship with the truth. The reason this is important to me, and I felt I had to really stand up personally, and it was hard to do because we did some tremendous reporting at CBS News. We helped secure access to the courts and benefits for 1 million service members in the United States and their families. So this is reporting that I am incredibly proud of. But no corporation should cross that red line and take a journalist's records. It has the effect of making it harder for people to work in the future, and that has the effect of cutting off the free flow of information to the public. And that is one of the bedrock principles of journalism that has to be protected under all costs.
So we're going to get to audience questions in a few minutes, but I'm sure if you're from the U.S., people are probably wondering, well, how can I potentially help on the Press Act? And so I figured I'd just spend a second kind of explaining exactly where this is in the process. I mentioned that the Press Act is incredible because it's so strong. And it provides
I just want to say, and it has bipartisan support.
Exactly.
And how many things in the U.S. Congress have that kind of support and unanimous support in the House?
Yeah, so the House has actually passed this bill unanimously, which is an incredible feat for any bill, given the extreme polarization in the U.S. and how everything turns into a partisan battle. So every single Republican, as well as every single Democrat, has supported it. It also has multiple powerful Republicans supporting it in the Senate, as well as powerful Democrats. And I would actually bet a lot of money if it actually comes up for a vote, it will pass overwhelmingly. But the issue in the Senate in the United States is that things don't often come up for votes, even when they're incredibly popular. And so there is a big push going on right now to contact your senator, to contact the majority leader, Chuck Schumer, to contact the Judiciary Chair, Dick Durbin, which the bill has to come out of, to make sure that this either gets in must-pass legislation before the end of the year or gets a standalone vote so that it can go to the president's desk before January 20th. Whether you have the ability to contact your senator either by phone or email, even just talking about this bill and its importance on social media can have a big difference because ultimately senators pay attention to that as well.
What I would add is that after I lost my job, I took a few months to really re-educate myself about the marketplace. So much had even changed in the nearly 5 years that I had been at CBS News, and I think we've really seen this in the last election in the United States. Really the power of these new platforms, whether it's YouTube or X or Instagram or the newsletters. I sometimes wonder whether we'll look back on the 2024 election as the one where Joe Rogan broke the back of 60 Minutes. Because Joe Rogan's interview with candidate Trump had over 26 million views the last time that I looked at it, and 60 Minutes might be 5 or 6, maybe 7 million viewers. So you can see the disparity in terms of the audience reach. For anyone who's on the fence about the Press Act, and maybe I sound like a broken record, but the Press Act is going to do something which is essential. It's going to protect these smaller, independent newsrooms and independent voices that are really emerging. And whatever your position on the political spectrum, these are the voices that you want to lift up and that you want to strengthen, and you want to have the protections in place so that over the next decade, because it could be another decade before we see this kind of legislation with real teeth to protect journalism. If you want to see those protections for reporters and their confidential sources, this is really the moment to say yes.
Absolutely. So one more question before we pass it along to the audience. You mentioned in one of your previous comments about journalists who may worry about this earlier in their careers. And I'm wondering, as somebody with 30 years of experience working across with some of the biggest networks in the world and facing these challenges, what's your advice to them if they are either facing a situation like this or are just worried that they have confidential sources and it's always a possibility?
What I would say is that I hope that I am the last journalist to have to run the uncertainty of the contempt gauntlet in the U.S. courts. I hope I'm the last person who has to face crippling fines of $800 a day. I hope I'm the last journalist who has to be asked by one of their children if they could lose everything, including their home, to protect this principle. If you don't have a credible pledge of confidentiality, investigative journalism is dead. You must stand on principle. And I have a lot of contacts in the Special Forces community, and if I could borrow a phrase from them, I really believe the protection of confidential sources is the hill to die on.
Well, that's a great place to leave it. So I believe there are microphones in the back of the room.
Don't be shy. Okay.
Oh.
Oh. There you go. Great. Okay.
Thank you very much for sharing your story, and I'm very sorry to hear it. And I apologize because I don't really know the Press Act, but if the government isn't allowed to survey anymore, does it protect journalists also from other companies surveying you? Because we know so much is outsourced now to consultancy firms, other firms. Will it protect journalists against surveillance from those and they selling on the data to governments?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that the primary purpose of the bill is to protect journalists from government surveillance or government legal orders. But that can potentially include courts, essentially issuing subpoenas of their own, or civil litigants who are issuing subpoenas under the protections of the courts. But it's true that there are so many private companies that hoover up so much internet data that, there's been stories about how private companies collect the location data on everybody's phone, and then the government buys that on the data broker market and can see where millions and millions of people are going every day, including many Americans. There is actually a separate bill in the Senate that is also very popular. It's called the Fourth Amendment is Not for Sale Act. This is kind of an end run around Fourth Amendment protections that the U.S. government has been engaging in the past several years, where they've essentially been told by the courts location data should be protected by a probable cause warrant. And so instead of going to service providers and gathering it themselves, the service providers sell it and then they buy it. This is, speaking of popular bills that would normally pass in any functional legislature, this is also a bill that would probably get 80 out of 100 votes if it actually comes up for a vote. Unfortunately, it has not yet. But so far as we know, at least, and this is, of course, no guarantee, there haven't been any cases that we know of directly involving journalists where the government has bought data on the private market and then used it to go after sources. And so that's cold comfort, of course. Sorry?
She said Assange.
With Julian Assange, the security firm in the embassy was UC Global, and they sold the surveillance on to Adelson, who then sold it to the CIA or gave it to the CIA.
We have an hour to talk about Assange coming up, so we will get to that.
Stay tuned. Other questions? Thank you. I'm just curious about the, in your case and similar ones, the impact on the sources. Have you had any indication from your sources how they feel that you're going to so much to protect them, and have sources that you use in other stories changed how they interact with you because of everything that's gone on?
That's a really great question, but that is a topic I just can't get into right now. But perhaps once this resolves, I'll be able to fully address that.
Other questions? See one up here.
Hi, sorry to bring it back to Assange, but just a question about the Espionage Act. Under the first Trump administration, he was prosecuted using that act. The Press Act, how would that work in relation to the Espionage Act? Would it prevent that type of prosecution?
That is a good question. We're definitely going to get into tons of Espionage Act stuff in the next hour. I would say briefly that before Assange, the Espionage Act has been used a lot over the last 10 or 15 years to go after not cases of espionage or people selling information to foreign governments, but to go after sources who approach American journalists with information that the American public deserves to know. And while this bill wouldn't stop Espionage Act investigations, it would potentially stop a potentially equally dangerous aspect of those investigations, which has also happened often over the past 10 or 15 years, where as part of these Espionage Act investigations, the government secretly spies on journalist communications to go after those sources. And so this has happened under both administrations, both Donald Trump and before that Barack Obama, where they actually went after over 20 different phone lines of Associated Press journalists. There was also a Fox News journalist who was caught up in an Espionage Act investigation where they were spying on his communications. And so while this bill wouldn't mean that journalists, that the government can't go after their sources in any case, it would at least protect the journalist side of things.
Mm-hmm. More questions? Okay.
Thank you so much to both of you for facilitating such a great conversation. And one question I wanted to ask about the CBS seizure of your materials. While it's not standard practice for news organizations to conduct those kinds of raids on their journalists' information, it raises a question about who the material belongs to. And I was wondering if you could potentially give some advice to journalists who do work for big organizations about how best to protect your information. I'm not saying to be skeptical all the time, but it is important to perhaps have copies of things that aren't on your organization's devices, things like that. But having gone through something like that, what would you have done differently to protect that information?
I want to be very careful because talking about confidential source protection, what I'll say is that after CBS seized my records, I did hear from journalists who said to me that many, many years ago that they had adopted the practice of keeping all of their information on their computer, for example, or on their phone or on their, their devices. They did not use any of the company-provided devices. So this was one way that they took an extra step in their minds to protect the information. It's sad to have to think of these things in your workplace, but what was always paramount to me was that my sources and the information from my confidential sources would be protected, which is why I went to the Met. And I said this earlier. I did hear from contacts who I've known for years, and who have really taken some risk to expose government corruption or wrongdoing, and they had very legitimate concerns over whether they might be identified as a result of those actions.
Any more questions?
Your situation is horrendous, and I can't imagine how awful it must have been for you. I think there is a very difficult question in what's happening in the press, more broadly, as well as in regards to this, because we've had cases here in the UK where individual journalists have also been, subject to prosecution, which, as you say, is a terrifying financial burden as well as emotional. And there isn't really that separation anymore between, you as an individual, whether there's any insurance available for this kind of thing. But there's a very serious question that we've had to cope with, which is around freedom of speech and how that impacts the conversation that people are having every day. And it's breached, so many regulations that we have here in Britain about hate speech in particular, which has been terrifying for people here, and, vulnerable communities. So, I don't know if you've got a digital act as part of, I think is part of this legislation that you're putting through in America. I mean, we're reviewing our digital policies here because of high levels of suicide, particularly young people, because of the way that the internet circulates information, that it's not tested, it's not checked and, verified. I mean, we're in a whole new game here. And, there aren't easy answers to any of these questions, it seems, because there's so much complexity all the time, and we don't know what is better and what isn't, and how to regulate, how not to regulate. So my question really is, how are we supposed to operate in this sort of environment?
Maybe I'll start. What I would say, and I can only speak for myself, but in my situation, crisis brought me a lot of clarity. That's not always the case, but it was for me, thank God, earlier this year, because having come through, the loss of a job, the seizure of my records, I essentially lost my health insurance, and we have a child who's a transplant patient, so he has a chronic medical illness, very dependent on my insurance, and insurance works very differently in the US than it does here. But the prescriptions off insurance for our son were over $2,000 a month. So I was facing that as well. But I came through all of that with a new clarity about the importance of the First Amendment, that this is a bedrock of the work that I have done for 4 decades, the importance of a free press in a functioning democracy. And a free press means ideas that aren't always comfortable, that aren't necessarily consistent with your own point of view, but they're part of the marketplace of ideas. And journalism is possible because of the risks that confidential sources take. And they must be protected to your fullest ability. And those things together, they really became my North Star after February of this year. So the crisis has brought me a lot of clarity, and that's how I find my direction. And I think we all have to find our own direction in this marketplace.
Hi, I'm from Guatemala, and we've been into a lot of criminalization of journalist cases too. I want to take this opportunity to have, this conversation when a journalist can tell, like probably to the other press freedom organizations, in your case, what do you think that supporting organizations could have done better, or like the strategic litigation support that you needed, things like that, and also like do the other way with you? What do you think that we as journalists have to, like, probably as a sector, to think about to these support mechanisms being more effective, so we can really get the help that we need when we need it? So maybe that role play could be useful for us.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I've actually been personally just overwhelmed at the amount of support I have received from different professional organizations. I've had support from the Columbia Journalism School, for example. I went to Columbia Journalism School. They went as far as to write affidavits in my case about how essential confidential source reporting is to investigative journalism. The Freedom of the Press Foundation has just been, they've had my back throughout this process. The committee, the Society to Protect, Professional Journalists, I mean, there's a dozen different organizations that have supported my case. I hope that that's going to be, enough, because ultimately the courts are going to decide. And what they decide is going to set the ground rules for every working journalist in the United States. Of course, I'm hopeful, and I'm working with every ounce of strength that I have for a positive outcome. I mean, I just, in my heart, that's what I'm really hoping to see. I hope that the Press Act can pass, and that this type of litigation will be really be a thing of the past.
And so, to take the second half of your question, and it's something, I alluded to before in my questions about journalists themselves just being more vocal in general about press freedom issues. It's actually a topic of the discussion when we're going to talk about the Julian Assange case in a little bit. But for various reasons, both reasonable and sometimes unreasonable, I think journalists are sometimes hesitant to speak out in favor of any issue. Of course, news organizations have all sorts of guidelines about when they're allowed and when they're especially not allowed to make their opinions known, and oftentimes journalists are erring on the side of caution here because, again, a lot of the media landscape in the US and around the world is very precarious for journalists. There are journalists getting laid off virtually all the time. The numbers are staggering at something like 10,000 or 20,000 journalists have lost their job in the last several years. So it creates the cautiousness that I think you were talking about, or a different type of chilling effect. But we have seen cases where journalists raising their voices around some issues can have an immediate impact. The best example of this is actually at the beginning of the Biden administration, when it came out that the Trump administration had spied on several news organizations late in Trump's first term. The Biden administration was initially continuing these cases until the news broke. And journalists were justifiably outraged. And so they were not only posting about their outrage on social media, but they were peppering the White House with questions in the White House Situation Room or the press office. They were questioning the Justice Department about their reasoning for continuing this. And within literally 2 days, the White House, which had said that they were going to be very hands-off with what the Justice Department was doing, announced a new policy saying, we're not going to do this anymore, and we're directing the Justice Department to create guidelines that they're not going to do this anymore. And it was a powerful example of how journalists can make a difference for everybody's press freedom rights very quickly if they so choose. And so that was great news. The problem was the rules that they wrote are internal guidelines. There's no legal enforcement mechanism. And of course, anytime there is a new attorney general or a new president, with the stroke of a pen, they can get rid of those rules. And that's potentially what we're facing now. All right, I've been told the time is up. So thank you so much. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you. Can we get this mic? Hi. Thank you, Trevor, and thank you, Catherine, so much. So we're going to take a